Welcome to the Intelligence Amplifiers, podcast that celebrates the people who make the intelligence a collective superpower. In every episode, we uncover the stories of learning and development leaders who amplify knowledge, break down silos, and empower teams to thrive. These are the enablers of insight, the ones turning expertise into action and shaping the future of work by ensuring that the right knowledge reaches the right people at the right time. So, if you're ready to explore how the intelligence is amplified and shared across organizations, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Hi, Maddie. Welcome to today's episode. Great to have you here.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me, Marko.
Awesome. And you are currently head of people development at Adyen globally?
Professional development, yes, and we're actually going through some changes. So I'm going to be focused more functionally soon, but yes, I'm just coming out of doing a role that's heavily focused on the professional development of the company.
Got it. Awesome. And I know you're doing some stuff at Adyen, which is kind of different than what is typical. So I'm going to double click on that later on. But first, I wanted to kind of go way back in your early career. We briefly crossed paths at Airbnb, and you started when Airbnb was a tinier company than it is today. And as far as I remember, it was also a non-traditional way you kind of got into learning and development. So what was that experience early on?
Yeah, let's actually take it back even further than that. I'm going to go way back to my childhood where I was just the consistent mediator of family drama. And I think quickly it emerged that I had this real draw towards behavior change, psychology, sociology. And so I just really started naturally investigating those areas of focus, both in university as well as coming out and really starting my career. Prior to Airbnb, was doing coaching for higher education programs. And that then led me very unnaturally into tech. And I, took a big bet on this little mom and pop shop called Airbnb. And at the time, I knew very little about what they did. And my best friend and roommate at the time, she was very invested and had started working there and was singing their praises. And so I thought to myself, why not give it a shot? I think I had kind of outgrown the development that I could have at the coaching organization I was then at. And yeah, I then entered the tech space really actually as a fairly entry-level customer experience agent. However, what they don't tell you is that customer service looks very different in the realm of tech. You're almost acting as a product specialist and a go-between from the engineering teams, and really got immersed very quickly into how fast-growing Airbnb really was. And I think where my kind of internal mobility story really takes off within the first 6 months of being at Airbnb was when I was asked to be a part of a super top secret project, then called Magical Trips, now called Experiences. It was a very unique opportunity to be immersed into a startup within a startup environment. So Airbnb was still fairly contained in size. However, the people working on this project were about 10 to 15. And so I really got to see product ideation from the ground up and really got to help create the customer experience team and what that looked like for this pillar of the business. So lots of learnings there, lots of twists and turns. So if there's anything specific you want to double click on, you can let me know.
Got it. And I find that interesting. So you early on discovered coaching and sort of like bettering up people and growing, pulling out the best out of people, getting to the full potential. You discovered it early on. You did that on your own. And then there was this a call for an adventure into Airbnb. And I remember you mentioned it wasn't quite what you were looking for as a role, but there was something about the culture that really called you out, like that you wanted to experience. What was that like in the early days?
Yeah, so I have been known to be called a culture carrier. And so naturally, I am heavily attracted to places that have a very strong identity and culture. And so the coaching company I actually had worked for prior had a strong culture I was deemed the director of fun at that company as far as just naturally leaning in. And when I did express interest in Airbnb and kind of entered that space, they had really robust core values, really significant attention to how you really work hard, play hard, that mentality. And so very quickly, I felt very at home and celebrated for my authenticity and how I like to exhibit for those who are insights discovery nerds, my yellow sociable big energy that I like to bring to the workplace. And so through that energy, I do feel like my internal mobility story then took its course more into the learning and development space at Airbnb. So multiple twists and turns in the space of experiences, and ultimately found myself redirecting that energy towards developing people in the context of account management, quality standards. And then finally, I was kind of bullish on my direction and saying, I'm going to get onto the learning and development team. It's the last thing I do. And so I just really tapped into my networks, identified what programs or projects needed support, and I just offered up my time in addition to what I was doing. And quite naturally then found myself in a solid place on the learning and development team for 2 years prior to going on to my next career adventure.
Got it. So culture carrier, so really caring about the culture and like kind of helping shape it, helping define it. And you start in this like secretive sort of startup within a startup, and then you kind of blazed your own path into, I want to help foster this culture, make it by design. And that led you to L&D ultimately at Airbnb, right?
Listen, I can't take credit for starting a startup within a startup or being responsible for that. But what I can say is that infusing a heavy dose of, creating psychological safety, leaning into your own strengths and understanding where you can add value and play a role that's going to drive the impact that you want to see, regardless of the realm, really is what benefited me in my natural progression through those different areas, for sure.
Got it. And when you were, I remember we were talking about this when you were at Airbnb. You were so in addition to behavioral change programs, hard conversations, I believe you also had something to do with the first manager onboarding training there.
Yeah, so I was lucky to be a part of multiple different initiatives, two of which really stand out. The kind of manager onboarding experience of what does it mean to either come in as a new leader or manager, and secondarily to that, arguably even more important, is when you're making this transition from being an individual contributor to being a manager and really having the foundational skills and understanding of how to really approach this transition and really applying that to the context of the business and the ways of working and the culture that we were just speaking of, because every company is going to have its own nuances and differences. Largely, there are a lot of the same challenges from company to company, but you do find that it's important to really cater it and resonate it to what is going on within the walls of that company and culture.
Got it. I mean, obviously, impacting managers has such a huge impact on the entire company, and especially impacting new hires that are managers, right? Because they're coming in, they're getting indoctrinated in this fabulous culture. And I had pleasure to work with a lot of Airbnb folks over many years, and I know how much culture is important, how it's by design and it's shaped specifically to be so. So you're kind of like getting the managers indoctrinated so that they can then carry the baton with their people and so on. So that's pretty big impact, I would say, when it comes to L&D.
Absolutely. And I think that's oftentimes, to your point, an area where I don't want to even use the word failure, but like the success rate of a leader in a new environment, I think is highly contingent on their ability to immerse themselves and really acclimate to their surroundings, because coming in and just being a sponge in the beginning rather than saying, I know exactly what I should do based on my experience. So it's a humbling experience for sure.
Speaking of success or failure, I remember you measured the impact of that, and you had some pretty remarkable results with the program at Airbnb, right? Like fairly high NPS and so on. How did you guys go about like measuring that and tracking the impact?
Yeah, so there was another program that was much more tailored to the tech side of the business. I was lucky enough to work with some really amazingly smart people on a tailored program for behavior change. So more of kind of that role play, really recreating that emotional response that you get when you're having a very difficult conversation and really getting to kind of more tap into that 70% of the 70-20-10 and just feel and like rinse, repeat practice. And we saw extremely high NPSs in the 90s for that program. And it was really rewarding to kind of see that transformation in some of these tech leaders to be able to really bring that to their teams and really advocate for spending time on their learning. I think the biggest thing that's always a challenge for us in L&D is people being intentional about carving out the time and the space to really invest in their learning and understanding how what they're consuming will translate to impact in their role, particularly in tech, right? Sometimes hard to translate how feedback models are going to actually further them in the space that they're driving, shipping code and doing things like that. So really having to also help people understand what the why behind why we're offering this and how this is going to develop you and impact the work that you do on the day-to-day.
I mean, you mentioned a couple of key concepts here. One is like creating a time and place. So like creating a container in which learning can actually and development can happen. You talked about indoctrinating leaders as managers to kind of lead with that in mind, and also having those courageous conversations and through that presumably creating that psychological safety where people can do their best work and feel empowered and so forth. So that's pretty awesome. And so any big lessons other than that from Airbnb in those days? You've seen it grow as a rocket ship.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I'm trying to distill it down to one. I think one big takeaway, that being my first big tech experience and just the pace. And I like to joke that I have anyone who's been in tech for more than 10 years, like their PhD in change management, because you're just, it's just like all comes at you. And it really is a learning curve, right? On understanding how to be nimble, how to be agile, how to not get overly committed to any one thing, knowing that tomorrow it could change. There's a reorg coming. We can feel it. So I'm sure that you can attest to and understand that. So I think just the ability to manage change and really just take yourself back to reminding yourself what is actually within your control. So when I think about career development, internal mobility, a lot of people that I coach and mentor fixate heavily on factors that are completely outside of their control. And while there is an understanding rationale behind that, it really is not kind of where the energy is best served spent, right? So the return on investment of that, the energy spent on things you can't control is not going to take you where you want to go. So I always just remind people of kind of three elements of kind of career development when I think about coaching or mentorship. And that's one, having a really, really good sense of what your strengths are. Do you truly know what is your unique value add that you're bringing that others are not around you? And what separates you from other people? Number two is establishing an extremely strong network of people that you know throughout the business and even external to the business, because those relationships are always going to come back around to support you in kind of navigation of your growth. And the third one is a combination between the focus on what's within your control and patience. We don't all have it, but it will do us wonders. And understanding that if you continue to invest the energy, be curious, have a growth mindset, and kind of connect your strengths to opportunities, it will come. You're planting a seed. It takes time to grow. So I think people oftentimes forget about patience element as well.
Got it. So focus on your strengths, build your network, people in your corner, right? And it takes time. So you have that mindset and the growth mindset basically to let it happen. So
yeah,
Powerful. Yeah, I'm curious. So it's interesting. You got into L&D from coaching point of view,
Yeah.
And so that's interesting and unique somewhat. And I remember Airbnb also had developed a pretty strong internal coaching / mentorship program.
Mhm.
And were you involved with that? Any comments on that? Or
Yes, I was involved from the standpoint that I was a mentor on the platform. And so I really can't, I think that's where I really started to come into my own of building this confidence that really anyone can be a mentor technically. You don't have to be classically trained. It's just what information and insight do you have that's going to be valuable to others? And how do you position that value and information to attract the right people to really have that transformative experience? I know it sounds corny, but I do have some really great success stories from working with various folks at Airbnb. And I kind of was displaying a value of I know what it means to go from an entry level role and really navigate internal mobility from a standpoint of not knowing what I want to do next, right? Not working backwards from a North Star, but the art of exploration, intentional exploration. And so I attracted a lot of people from the customer experience side of the organization, a lot of people from kind of more of the account management side of the organization, specialists across the organization. So it was very rewarding to be able to talk through some of those challenges that they were having, fixating on things that weren't in their control or having more of that fixed mindset. And I think the platform enabled me to kind of position myself, and it naturally attracted the right people at the right time that I felt like I could really support.
yeah, and I had the privilege to work on that platform, help built it actually for at Airbnb. And what was super interesting was that democratized approach. It was that idea that everyone can be a mentor, and that was something that was very sort of pioneering at the time. I remember, so we built it and launched it at Airbnb. And that year, about a year later, we hosted Airbnb speaker at Technocon. And so they're sharing some of the data. And I remember just vaguely some of the numbers, but I think at the time you had about 6,000 employees and about 600 of them became mentors within a span of a year. And it was basically all sorts of employees throughout the company. And it was hundreds of sessions, and it was just remarkable, sort of a very quick and pretty awesome adoption. And it was based on this peer mentorship model that was kind of unique and progressive at the time. So very cool stuff. Yeah. So
yes, very fond memories of it for sure.
Yeah. Cool. So you had this like amazing, and by the way, I totally agree with you. Working in tech, you have all these changes happening, right? So I was at Twitter for about a year, 2.5 years. Had 5 managers in 2.5 years, and I remember somebody in engineering actually built like a big, one of those big dashboards that everyone can see in the office, and it was days since last reorg. We were actually kind of jokingly counting this all along. So such is the nature of the beast. Yeah. Cool. So you kind of had this experience of like a tiny Airbnb going through its rocket ship growth, and you've seen it all. You survived it. You thrived in it. Had amazing results along the way, and then you decided it was time to go for a change. So, what was your reasoning?
Good question. I was at Airbnb for almost 8 years. So, and then similarly to being in tech and knowing change management like the back of your hand, I almost equate years at a tech company like dog years. You like multiply it by 7, and that's how long it really truly feels with all the changes that happen. And I am so lucky that I had the opportunity to experience and learn so many things. And I think I just felt the sense of readiness for a new challenge, a new chapter, completely different environment. I was pretty open to exploration, and it just so happens that a friend of mine was talking to Adyen, and she had spoken to a recruiter and thought that I would be very much intrigued by the company and the culture of the company. She knows I am very much into culture. And sure enough, she was correct. So I went through the motions of expressing interest in a learning and development manager role at Adyen and learned a ton about the financial technology space. Adyen is truly unique in the market, as I've learned a lot more about fintech and just the very, the curated innovative solutions around financial services. So I quickly became interested in the complexity also of the space, moving away from hospitality and just seeing things through a very different lens. What challenges does that present that might be different than the ones that I addressed at Airbnb? And the role and the scope all really spoke to me. So I took the leap and said, I really believe I'm ready. And I think, I have a pretty good gut, except for the fact that I am lactose intolerant. And I'm feeling outside of that. I think my gut is pretty good at telling me and signaling if it's a good decision. And I just took the leap. And what I really loved to see immediately was just the deep investment that the company had in learning, as far as the size of the team, the types of initiatives that they were working on, and really just liking to build from within. Not a lot of vendor kind of connectors, lots more just build from within, and deep sense of integrating that cultural piece of the Adyen formula. And one of the formula points of Adyen is actually create your own path, towards your full potential. And so it's this idea of just the exploration, and it's not one linear path. There are so many different directions that you can go and take your development. And that truly is literally kind of threaded into my identity of how I've explored my growth and how I've progressed in my career. So I saw a deep sense of compatibility in all of those different areas. And I'm super glad that I made the switch.
That's super interesting. That autonomy mastery. That's what I'm kind of hearing. Purpose, the whole Daniel Pink sort of formula, and many paths to the same top of the mountain. So as long as you have the kind of, you're empowered to choose your path, you'll get there. It was interesting, Adyen being in fintech and us talking about learning and development space. I would imagine that the focus would be highly on compliance, right? Versus, hospitality can be a little bit more fluffy and it's about culture and so on. But it seems like that culture is very, very important. And you're finding the same thread that you had at Airbnb in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I definitely see a lot of compatibility between how these founder-led companies have approached integrating culture into the DNA of everything that they do. And that is not at all different at Adyen, as far as like the deep belief and the consistent messaging and the top-down reinforcement of, and the embodiment and the showing up behaviorally in that way, I think has been very much appreciated. And I think that's kind of what really creates that spark of this is genuine, right? And even though I'm learning a lot about, to your point, the compliance-driven nature of this space, it really doesn't take away at all from the ability to prioritize, driving those aspects of the company with it's still in alignment with the formula. So, I think they do a wonderful job of balancing the two, I'd say.
Got it. And I'm curious, Airbnb being a Silicon Valley company, there's also the culture that we're sort of embedded within, and Adyen is primarily European-based, right? Are you seeing a lot of differences there, or is kind of like the tech world transcending all that and the borders are imaginary?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And it's funny. One of the developmental opportunities I felt I had in making the decision to switch companies was that I had never worked for a European-based company before. And I think that well, one thing it does is it builds empathy for not being in the main time zone, right? So like I was historically always in the exact main time zone from a West Coast, Pacific Standard Time perspective. And now it's really about understanding what it means to be kind of further outside of that and navigating, the balancing act of being on a global team. And then in addition to that, just the cultural nuance and differences, right? I think when you think about the different cultures and the norms and how they orchestrate business, those differences translate. When you have a US-based company, I'm fairly familiar with what that's like and how the culture operates. But a European-based company is very different. And I think, I don't know if I'm going to assume, but maybe not, you've read The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer, but I think there's a lot of interesting takes on behaviors and tendencies based on culture and communication. And so I've been very excited to dig into that at Adyen as a result of how do we grow in these other, regions and markets and really understand businesses and the art of communication and building trust. And so we integrate a lot of that kind of thinking as we think about how do you deliver feedback, across various different cultures and regions. And so I've had just an amazing time kind of working globally and going to all the different offices regionally to really better understand kind of what those differences are and how to bring people closer together. And one of our formula points is talk straight without being rude, which I think is heavily indexed on that cultural difference in Europe of being a bit more directive in communication while still maintaining an objective view and as to it not to be impactful in a negative or rude way. So yeah, it's been very eye-opening working in a different for a different company in a different cultural context.
Got it. And I get this as your sort of strategic vision, what you're trying to create. What are some of the primary tools you use on a day-to-day basis? Like, and what I mean by that, is this a manager onboarding program? Is it ERG? Is it formal, informal mentorship programs? Like, how do you what do you lean on, or is it just a toolbox of stuff that you have to kind of foster this culture and execute on the vision?
Yeah, so I think from the cultural side, the Adyen formula is very much deeply rooted in the onboarding of all employees. And so that's something that comes very quickly at the beginning of your experience and finding various different ways from a social learning perspective to better understand. We have, a coffee chat culture where you are kind of immediately immersed in building your network when you enter the company and really encouraged to carve out intentional time to do that. We have just generalized programming, both, for leaders and for individual contributors that really focus on the foundational needs. And so some of those foundational needs is really one, feedback. We know that no company necessarily does that perfectly as far as having a feedback culture. And so it's been amazing to see the work that we've been able to do over the last few years to really move the needle on creating more of that feedback culture. One really important concept that is connected to the formula point that I had mentioned before about creating your own path is this concept of owning your growth. Own your growth is really a call to action to be in the driver's seat of your growth and knowing that no one's going to knock on your door and say, hey, I'm going to hand you this golden opportunity out of nowhere. So it's really instilling and reinforcing the growth mindset that being curious and really being in the, you take the action, right? There are people there to support you, and here's what their role is in doing that. But ultimately, my goal, particularly in the professional development realm, is empowering people regardless of how good or skilled their leader is. Because at the end of the day, I know a lot of people say people leave because of managers, and that's true. And ultimately, you don't again, it goes back to that control. You don't have control over who your leader or manager is. And so what do you do to take control of your development with the tools that you have? So we have workshops that are also heavily indexed on understanding how to own your growth tangible and what are things that you can do from where you sit as an individual contributor to really push that
Got it. So it's that radical autonomy, and then giving both tools and time to explore your own personal growth. Yeah. And speaking of I remember when you and I spoke about how you approach growth. You mentioned something that was interesting to me. Typically, what I've been taught, at least, is to re-engineer from the future, right? Like, I want to be, at certain point in time, place in the future, and then work backwards. What does that mean? Which skills do I need to get there? Your philosophy was slightly different. It was about experience-driven and forward-looking versus... Can you talk a little bit about that? I found that interesting.
Yes, for sure. So it's just, for as long as I can remember, I had never had this super clear, I am working backwards from this specific milestone, this specific moment. I would say I make shorter term milestones that I feel like are approachable, yet not limiting. I find that especially if I talk to someone in the tech space, I ask them, 6 months ago, are you doing now what you thought you would be doing? And typically the answer is no. And I think in a world where there's a lot of change comes a lot of opportunity. And I think once people pigeonhole themselves into saying, I am going to do this next thing, it then limits their potential view of what else is there. And I definitely think it's okay to have, a vision for what you want to do. Like if someone wants to become the head of learning and development and want to work backwards and experience and make another decision along the way, I think that also works. I think what I like to remind people of is that not everybody works like that. And there is definitely this feeling of a societal pressure to know, like, what's your 5-year plan? It's a question a lot of people get. And it's one that I just don't love giving a direct or straight answer to. I feel like there are different approaches on figuring out along the way where you're going to inevitably be in 5 years. And what I want to almost say is I want to be somewhere that I never thought possible I would be in 5 years. Because I just don't even, they say that your job doesn't exist yet. That job in 5 years, it doesn't exist. And so how can I possibly know or work backwards from it if it hasn't even happened or it hasn't been created yet? So I think that mindset has definitely very much made me successful up until this point. I think it's also okay as you gain more decades of experience to get clearer and sharper on what that looks like. I just have taken the approach and mindset to be more experiential and exploratory and being very mindful and reflective of what have I taken from this and what do I want to immediately do now with that? And then just kind of build off of that. Sometimes that direction goes up, sometimes it goes lateral. I just love the optionality of it all.
Yeah, and that's exactly the key word here. I think that for me, it was optionality, creating optionality. And that's super valuable in the world that's constantly changing. And there's also there's a playful element to it. I really enjoyed that sort of like, kind of being in touch authentically with what feels right and choosing those options as they present themselves and just kind of being open to the magic of life and seeing where it takes you.
Thanks. Quite enjoyable.
Yep. So speaking of which, what's next for you? What are you excited about?
What's my 5-year plan? Just kidding.
Yours?
Oh no. What is next for Maddie Combs? Let's see. I am very excited to further immerse myself into the business. So, at Airbnb, I kind of knew the product a bit. But really I had roles that were more directly connected to the business, right? I was working on customer experience. I heard directly from the hosts and the guests. Pivoting into Adyen in my role as in learning and development has been a bit more removed, right, from the day-to-day or the product or, all of the different innovations and decisions and things that are happening. And this next chapter, I think, is going to be heavily indexed on getting closer to the business and understanding the inner workings so I can really, really transform learning on the job. I think a big task for all of us in L&D is figuring out that 70% on the job learning, behavior change, and really being able to ideally measure it and the return on investment of it all. And I think this next chapter is going to be heavily focused on innovative strategies around how do you bring the learning to life in the context of the day-to-day for various different functions. So super, super excited to get creative in doing that with the team.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And if you were to give a piece of advice to a younger self starting in your career, what would that be? And does anything come to mind?
Advice to my younger self. I think advice to my younger self would be, I think confidence essentially was something that I had to build over time. And I think that that's okay. And that makes sense. And it's a humbling experience on the journey. And I would say to my younger self that don't lead with doubt, lead with curiosity. I think I've really come into my own with that now. I think confidence could still be heightened. And I think there's this balance between not presenting as overly confident, but also owning the information and the, what you have to give the world. And so I probably would tell myself that turn the doubt into curiosity and don't lean into consistently doubting if you're making the right decision or if that's the right answer or there's always a learning from everything. I mean, they say the acronym FAIL is the first attempt in learning. And so not having that fear or doubt in something and just choosing to learn from it is something that I would have told my much younger self.
Got it. I love how your experience of your entire arc is a big learning experience, and that's how you're approaching it. And then you're also empowering others to pull that out of themselves as well, to be the best versions of themselves. So I really love that aspect.
Thanks. There's always be closing and always be learning. That's my acronym that I usually like to move forward with.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Maddie. That was awesome thank you for sharing your story. And it was awesome learning about your journey, and best of luck with everything you're building.
Thanks for having me and happy learning.
That's it for this episode of the Intelligence Amplifiers. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe or follow so you don't miss out on the future episodes. And if you're interested in being a guest or have a question, check out the episode description for how to reach us. Also, don't forget to check out Plus Plus, the platform that makes collective intelligence at scale possible. Find out more at plusplus.co. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep amplifying.